So what I want to present are some preliminary ideas. The first stage is in a process of pattern recognition across, if I can, most or all of Spielberg's directorial features. So this is will eventually be a 9,000 word chapter, and I'm trying to present a small portion of it here. But as I always tell my students, don't present the best bits. Present the bits that you want feedback on, or you want a road test. So that's kind of what this is today. So I'll begin with some examples. Over the course of Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones sheds his skepticism. He initially dismisses the superstitious hocus pocus about the Ark of the Covenant. And for him, the world's religions offer textual and artifactual clues that will lead him from the pagan polytheists of the South American Jovitos via Sufi mysticism and ancient Egyptian burial sites to the very sources of Judaism. But finally, he's forced to take up a spectatorial position when the Ark is opened. He does not widen his eyes, powerless to resist the spectacle as the Nazis do. Instead, he keeps his eyes firmly shut and tells Marion to do the same. So only by refusing to look can he be saved from the wrath of God, in a vivid visualization of the hocus pocus as visual effect that scorches eyes and destroys the camera. Jones chose the correct way to spectate, and his life is spared. In Close Encounters of the Third Kind, our protagonist, Roy Neary, wants an explanation for the phenomena, the lights in the sky that he's been witnessing. He's presented to us early on in the film as a quixotic or nostalgic dreamer. He wants to take his kids to see Disney's Pinocchio, while they would rather play goofy golf. And Neary's Wish Upon a Star, which is a song actually quoted in John Williams's score for the film, he has this yearning just to get a clear look at the object of his desires. And this is counterpointed at the start of the film in a scene where air traffic controllers follow a UFO on radar monitors. And this machine-augmented prosthetic vision is insubstantial compared to the full light show that is put on for Neary and the other spectators at the film's conclusion, all of whom get to see with their own eyes. So the aliens choose Neary as Earth's ambassador, picking him out of a lineup of robotically unsmiling military types, bottom left there, in which he's the only one not wearing dark glasses. And the whole plot of Hook concerns a man who has to regress to a childlike state to rescue his children from Dustin Hoffman's piratic clutches. We first see him failing to pay attention to his daughter's school play, while all around him children are gaping in awe. When transported to Neverland, suspension of disbelief and reversion to a childlike outlook, divorced from the imperatives of work and adulthood, enable him to taste invisible food, to fly, and to fight, to master his representational and spatial environments. It also teaches him to be a better father by being and looking more like his kids. In Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is made after but set before Raiders of the Lost Ark, Jones is deflected from his quest for fortune and glory when he witnesses the enslavement of children in the mines of the brutal Dougie cult. He chases the legendary Shankara stones because they're full of diamonds, but he returns them to their owners because they have magical protective powers. So witnessing for himself something previously believed to be a local legend transforms Jones from opportunistic tomb raider to altruistic rescuer. And in a comparison here, a parallel which I'm sure Spielberg might not want to play up, we see Oskar Schindler's shift from personal interest to interventionist. Spielberg worked with Steven Spielberg on the Schindler's List script in order to structure the film around Schindler's change of heart and to make it a more gradual change than it is in the original book by Thomas Keneally. So it really stresses this change that Schindler undergoes across the film. And the turning point for Schindler is when he witnesses the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. He's set up as a quintessential Spielbergian observer, looking down on the city while the massacre is played out, as if it's seen through his eyes from his perspective, although it obviously has an impossible omniscience. The impact of the slaughter is captured with a very simple visual effect, the sight of a girl in a red dress, which is the only point of colour in the scene. And she metonymically stands in for the masses of dead, allowing Schindler to visually individuate the Jews whom the Nazis are working so hard to depersonalise and reduce to numbers, objects, dust. In these and other examples that I'll return to later, Spielberg's films feature protagonists whose beliefs are challenged or who must overturn their worldview in order to find peace or make sense of the world they inhabit. Now, this theme is not by any means exclusive to Spielberg, but the way that he depicts that progression through moments of spectacle, vision, and witnessing is, I think, distinctive. To some critics, Spielberg has generated reactionary Reaganite entertainment, in Andrew Britton's phrase. His fondness for stories about absent or failing fathers represents a nostalgic yearning for the return of paternalistic, authoritarian rule and the reinstatement of the white male hero. Others scapegoat Spielberg for the infantilization of Hollywood cinema, partly for his interest in special effects. Molly Haskell likened the experience of watching Jaws to being a rat given shock treatment on account of its skillful delivery of scares and surprises. The scale and the breadth of critical objections to Spielberg are too big to go into here. But the perception of his work as childishly regressive has been a tenacious reputation. Drenching these criticisms of Spielberg's films as manipulative, as sentimental and stupefying is the implication that spectacle and artificial spectacle, as represented by special effects, is the enemy of narrative, intellect, contemplation, and ideas. So under these criticisms, spectacle is the unfair advantage that privileged filmmakers can use to overwhelm the spectator's critical faculties. So ultimately, it's argued, Spielberg covers up social reality with a comforting substitute. And you can see a recurring theme in a couple of these quotations to liken, to compare Spielberg to propaganda and to Disney in the same breath. I might suggest instead that Spielberg's near-fetishistic return to thematically integrated moments that foreground the act of spectating, the emotional charge of a thing witnessed, are not invitations to uncritically gape, but self-reflexive inscriptions of the audience that stress the narrational value of special effects as much as their visual pleasures. Recently, critics and biographers such as Peter Kramer, Joseph McBride, Warren Buckland and others have mounted cogent defences of Spielberg as a valid object of study through empirical, historical, neo-formalist and cognitivist methodologies. Nigel Morris's route into a defence of Spielberg is to point to the way he inscribes the cinematic apparatus metaphorically, metonymically within the frame, in a way that gives the director's films the same qualities of self-reflexivity and formal sophistication that we have no trouble attributing and celebrating in the films of more already culturally acceptable artists. And there are indeed hundreds of examples of Spielberg's shots that feature beams of light, often heavily diffused and often from behind the characters. There's just a few examples here. Sometimes Spielberg reifies that light, as in the abstract glows that are gradually revealed to be from spacecraft in Close Encounters, whose occupants seem to live and thrive in a warm light and heavenly choruses. We also see it in the glow and the lens flare that shrouds Tinkerbell in Hook, or the shaft of sunlight that points the way to the Ark of the Covenant in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spielberg sometimes calls this his God light. And the spiritual interpretation there is there if you want it. But it's really evoking the awe that is supposed to follow dazzling spectacle, even as it obscures clear vision and overwhelms the visual faculties. It often flares as if the light is more than the camera can handle. But according to Morris, Spielberg's light rays, metonymically inscribing the projector, signify desire. So this resembles the film-going experience for Morris. They mirror the spectator's subjection before the image, as in the scene towards the end of AI, where David, the boy robot, becomes locked into a Plato's cave of sole focus on the blue fairy, caught in a feedback loop of wishing upon an inanimate representation of his deepest desire. Now, even without the psychoanalytic framework that Morris applies to link Spielberg's visual aesthetic to his thematic preoccupations, we can find manifestations of spectacular strategizing. It's often remarked upon that he uses a lot of shots of characters gazing off screen, delaying that reverse shot where we get the big ecstatic reveal of what it is that they're looking at. And eyeline matches in all of these shots can also be used to pinpoint and hold together composited elements in an effect shot and sell the idea that the simulated object of the gaze is really present by confirming with looks that there is something there to be looked at. So these are all shots of people looking at stuff from Close Encounters. This is both an affective device to elicit a mirrored sense of wonder and excitement, but also a tease, since our sharing of the spectacle is delayed. It's close to what Vivian Sobchak calls special affect, where diegetic awe and spectatorial wonder are united. Now, it's tempting to characterize, and many have, to characterize the Spielbergian inscribed spectator as passive, as still, and not reacting. But I would suggest watching is the first step towards seeing, to reading, interpreting, and responding. Now, according to Dan Ruby, who's by no means a Spielberg defender, the fact that Jaws was so phenomenally popular with audiences is an expression of the society's consciousness and should be approached critically in terms of that consciousness rather than as the private vision of a director. So for him, it's as if the film serves as a national mood ring, crowdsourcing a State of the Nation reading through the mass response it received. And I don't think Spielberg's popularity and his populism are solely the result of him empathically choosing things that people are moved, scared, or fascinating by. There is an aesthetic of communality or shared experience in these stylistic tropes that inscribe spectatorship, as in, and I haven't seen this mentioned elsewhere, but it kept coming back to me, this recurrent motif of the stadium sequence, as I want to call it, where a spectacular set piece is staged in a demarcated, sometimes quasi-studio or stadium setting before a large diegetic audience. Now, all of these techniques and visual strategies comprise a large part of the way Spielberg addresses a mass, or at least a broad audience, with an aesthetic of communal spectacle that inscribes not just the cinematic apparatus, but the audience as well. And I want to circle back round now to the examples that I started with. As Spielberg offered to atone for the grotesque excesses of Temple of Doom by making a third film that critiqued and personalized the legacy of a heroic figure who had already become a kind of hollow archetype. At the climax of The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones has to save his father's life and retrieve the Holy Grail by undertaking 3 challenges. The first 2 test his close reading skills, as he has to interpret medieval inscriptions to avoid being decapitated or falling into a chasm. But the third asks him to cross a ravine and let his faith carry him. And it is, to me, interesting and no coincidence at all that this crucial challenge, which brings about the restoration of the father, takes place on and around a matte painting. Jones's seemingly impossible step into the empty air is articulated in the language of visual effects. Harrison Ford appears to step across the matte line and into the painting itself, to transgress a boundary that we've learned to respect. So again, a test of personal belief and a major character development, grandiose though it may be, is mapped onto a moment of self-reflexive spectacle. Now, in the Indiana Jones films, a number of matte paintings are deployed for establishing shots to show particular locations where the action is about to happen. There's another kind that he uses in all of the Indiana Jones films that I'm interested in. You can see Spielberg making use of the flatness of the image to represent a dead stop to the action in what I'm calling the precipice shot, which happens in all of the films where a chase sequence will be ended, at least for some of the participants, by a sudden drop into a chasm which appears very abruptly. So rapid action in Last Crusade, as in the tank chase towards the end, mixes long and short focal length shots, and this impact aesthetic, as Jeff King calls it, leads into the striking conclusion of a big pullback to a match shot of the precipice that they're about to fall into. This is an earlier sequence from Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the chase suddenly cuts through these big changes in scale to matte painting, sudden interruption. Now, digital technologies are still wrapped in a rhetoric of smoothness, of blending, seamlessness, fluidity, and integration. Examples such as these matte paintings, on the other hand, seem to benefit from the dynamic, even disruptive combinations of different techniques. Spielberg's close relationship with ILM, from before it became predominantly a digital effects and animation workshop, gave him access to a catalogue of model work, compositing, matte paintings, puppets, whatever was needed. So what I find interesting about these is the use of the very properties of the matte painting to create this blunt impact where we cut out to a different spectacular register. And I might even suggest that there's an aesthetic sudden shift as well as we move to a painted and a painterly composition all of a sudden. It accentuates that sudden surprise. It's important to note that if there are some rigid continuities in Spielberg's style, the uses to which he puts these narrational repetitions are not constant. So I want to conclude by pointing to a major shift that occurs around the time of AI, 2001, after which Spielberg's attention is frequently turned to questions of surveillance and skepticism about discourses of authority. So we move from protagonists exercising and honing their scopic mastery of their environment to being made subjects of state surveillance and the technological gaze, as seen in Minority Report, War of the Worlds, Munich, and The Terminal. And he's framed this change partly through a self-reflexive replaying of scenes from his own filmic past. I'd be happy to talk more about this, but I'll finish on just one example from War of the Worlds. This 2005 alien invasion narrative is, like Close Encounters, in dialogue with America's science fiction genre history, but also with the 1953 film of War of the Worlds. The most obvious shift in Spielberg's new version is that while once Spielberg's alien visitors brought peace, they now bring destruction. And that destruction is shown to us through a very contemporary visual syntax of public pandemonium, panic and disorder, along with quite troubling metonyms of genocide, a sky full of clothes and a river of corpses. Beams of light, if they were ever signifiers of desire, as Nigel Morris argues, take the form now of a heat ray that disintegrates bodies in an instant. The heroes of War of the Worlds are bystanders with little influence over the visiting aliens. And the home invasion sequence is played out with searing, surveilling light. The aliens' arrival happens in front of a gathered crowd, as it did in Close Encounters. The tone and the outcomes of these encounters are completely different from one film to the next. But the structures of the gaze, the light, and the inscribed audience have very much returned. But I think what I'm tentatively suggesting is that Spielberg's own preoccupations and motifs are so persistent that the style is only partially inflected by the introduction of new technologies into the mix. So even as they inscribe the experience of watching a film into their diegetic action, Spielberg's films frequently present us with a network of looks that carve out a filmic space into which a spectacular thing, whatever it may be, can be inserted. And the rigidity of this spatio-temporal filmic venue for the presentation of spectacular effects sequences, bounded by looks and structured by narrative imperatives, intensifies the technological varieties that are staged there. And our role as spectators is to read that framed and demarcated spectacle for its semic, semiotic or narrative content as it stages acts of critical witnessing, or what Stephen Heath calls dramas of vision. And of course, as I've always tried to argue in relation to special effects, the way in which an effect is achieved contributes to the formation of meaning by conferring graphic properties and technological discourses from outside the text upon the image. On Friday, John Belton's excellent talk argued that the use of digital intermediates and all of the associated processing of the image that goes on during that post-production stage smoothly integrates variously sourced image elements, effacing their ontological differences with an overall gloss of similarity. But a special or visual effect is not just an element that disappears or blends in and settles into its allocated place in the diegesis. It can be a formalized, even ritualistic, narratively and semically significant event. So we can't talk only in terms of what effects are or are made of. We need to begin from what they do. And this is an image that I wanted to finish on because to complete a chain of references to Man with a Movie Camera. And it's sort of apropos of nothing, but I had it in a sleepless moment early this morning. This connection here, the way in which the aliens in War of the Worlds are coded as cameras. They are obviously on tripods, and they invade the home through this long eye-like apparatus which snakes into rooms. So it's a metaphor of surveillance for Spielberg, but it's also a reversal of what had gone before, a reversal of the gaze where the look becomes the invader rather than the thing which is exerted upon the spectacle. So this really articulates for me that switch that Spielberg undergoes to metaphors of surveillance, the look returned, in this case, the monstrous look monstrously returned. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.